Tuolumne, Iowa expressed so well the spirit of our friend George Ayittey, who was an honored friend. And I'd like to introduce you to some other elements of his thought, not only his noble and honorable life, but some of his lasting legacy. And I do so in the hope that you also will be inspired to draw on this man's remarkable life in order to realize his vision of a continent of people who are free, who are prosperous, who are at peace, who enjoy dignity, and who are proud of their histories and proud of their accomplishments and justifiably hopeful about the future. Professor George B. N. Ayittey was born October 13, 1945, here in Ghana. He graduated from high school and then received a Bachelor of Science degree in economics from the University of Ghana, went on for his graduate studies in Canada with a master's degree from University of Western Ontario and a doctorate in economics from the University of Manitoba. He taught in Canada and the United States and retired after many years as a professor of economics at American University in Washington, D.C. I first got to know him and corresponded with him in the 1980s. I was editing an academic journal, and he submitted a paper with the title, African Peasants and the Market System. And I read it. I said, well, this would be interesting. It wasn't just interesting, it was eye-opening. It was a big change in my life. He was able to show us things that other people didn't see. He was a great student of African institutions and of the ways that African people had solved problems and ordered their affairs long before European or Arab colonialists showed up and divided up Africa and her people and forcibly and brutally subjected them to foreign practices and institutions. George was very confident, and justifiably so, in the ability of Africans to solve their own problems. They had been doing so long before people came from other continents to divide their nations and to dominate them. When he was a research fellow at Stanford University, he buried himself in the research library and did extensive work for a magisterial book, Indigenous African Institutions. This is a wonderful book. It's a bit hard to get now, but I'm talking to publishers about bringing it back into print because it is a wonderful and brilliant book. He looked at the institutions of law and governance, property and exchange, arbitration and peacemaking by which Africans have solved their own problems. Now, those institutions still exist, but they're often submerged under the bureaucracy and the sheer violence that was brought by the colonial powers. In many cases, these indigenous institutions that still exist are denigrated. They are looked down on. They're mocked as being somehow backward. But in fact, they are exactly parallel to the institutions that function in other parts of the world, in Europe, in Asia, in the Americas. In that first paper that I published in 1988, George described savings clubs. They're known in the academic literature as tontines, but by many names in African languages, including Susu in this region. And he described how people voluntarily pool their finances in order to finance business enterprises, capital investments, and much more. He noted that when foreign visitors come to Africa and observe or study Africans, they referred to these as, quote, primitive accumulation. But then he added with a wink, because George had a wicked sense of humor, he added with a wink, he said, in America, they're called savings and loan associations. And you find them on the street corners of every town. And they are identical in function. Now, his last book, which he published before he's left us, is a really brilliant work. I strongly recommend that you get a copy, and I can tell you how. George was an economist, and if I were to say the book is free, he would wag his finger at me and say, "Tom, you know nothing is free." The correct expression is, it cost 0 cedis. The price is 0. So you can download this book if you go to africanliberty.org/applied economics. The whole book is there. It's an outstanding work of economics from an African perspective, which makes this book authentically unique. Also, the sponsoring organization, Africa Center for Enterprise and Youth Empowerment, has it on their website as well. So you can download it from there. The book has been reviewed by top economists. I'll mention just a couple. 2 Nobel Prize winners in economics, so that's really the highest achievement in the field, robustly endorsed the book. Professor Thomas Sargent from New York University wrote, he said, "Applied economics is Africa's economic story, a powerful introduction to the practice of market economics." Another Nobel Prize winner, Vernon Smith, robustly endorsed the book. He said, "Applied economics for Africa is a winner." This is an outstanding book of economics for students. And Harvard University professor Jeffrey Myron said the book is, quote, "essential reading for anyone interested in economic development, whether in Africa or anywhere else." These are very high words of praise for a truly great scholar. George opened the eyes of so many people, and I'm one of them. He taught us to see beyond the stereotypes of African achievement that have been promulgated by ideologues who impose crudely understood foreign patterns on African development, by foreign aid agencies that deny agency to African people themselves, and by dictators who ignore and stamp out the voices of African people. They all have something in common. They all see Africans as helpless, incapable, needing guidance and direction from others, whether it's a foreign aid agency or a local dictator. What they don't see is African people as active, working, thinking, dreaming, innovating, and self-directing people. I'm going to quote my colleague Olamayiwa Okederan in a wonderful essay he wrote some years ago, Africa's Promise of Liberty. He described how a typical African city is a huge marketplace. A visit to Lagos, Nigeria, shows the enterprising nature of Nigerians. It's a bustling hub of entrepreneurship. And then he gives examples. All the people, which would be quite recognizable to anyone here, who are looking for business, offering service and value to customers. And he said, this is the Africa I know. It's not the Africa that many intellectuals and politicians see. They need to open their eyes. He was convinced, George was, of the reality of African agency. It was not just a hope, but a conviction that Africans can and will prosper, and that the African century has already begun. But it will continue only if people stop trying to copy foreign patterns and to instead realize the strength of the so-called traditional or informal activities of their fellow countrymen and countrywomen, and stop disrespecting their own traditions. He gives an example drawn from Japan. Japan is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It's a powerhouse. And he described first African kingships and the rituals involved in that, and how people denigrate that. Psh, psh, that's backward. Then he described how Emperor Akihito became emperor of Japan. He had to perform an all-night vigil of prayers to his divine ancestress, the goddess of the sun. He prayed for peace and abundant harvests. Then he wore white silk and a headdress made of feathers. And he went in and dished out food to his guests, the 8 million kami, or gods of Japan, their traditional gods. Afterwards, he retreated behind a screen and asked the spirit of the sun goddess to accompany him. And when he emerged, he was now the living embodiment of Nagini no Mikoto, the god of the ripened rice plant, and the new emperor of Japan. And then again, with a bit of a wink, he said, African scholars and leaders may note that Japan, an economic superpower, did not have to renounce its ancient Shinto beliefs to achieve that status. They did not have to become westernized to become modernized. They could remain Japanese. Modernization does not have to mean westernization or Asianization. It does not require abandoning traditional culture. Instead, what is needed is to modernize by realizing modern Africanization or African modernization. That is the route to prosperity. Economic development isn't fundamentally about building just big factories or big tech parks or big structures. That is a mistake. It's not the only route to become wealthy. Economic development isn't about big stinky factories, although they might bring development. What is economic development? It's the ability of any person picked at random, just someone on the street you don't know, when that person's ability to consume more is increased. Better health care, better food, a nicer house, longer life. That's economic development. So when my mother-in-law, for the first time, got eyeglasses, to take a simple example, we take that for granted. She comes from a very, very, very poor village. When she got eyeglasses for this first time, we took her, we said, Mom, come to the eye doctor and get glasses. Oh, no, they're too expensive. Please, do it. She cried all day because she could see her grandchildren. She could see them up close. She knew their voices, but from a distance she couldn't recognize them. This was economic development, the ability now to see her grandchildren. But it's a myth that economic development comes only from factories or state projects. Africa is littered with failed state projects that don't work and didn't deliver any development. So I want to give you an example of a very rich country, New Zealand. Probably acquainted with New Zealand. It's extremely wealthy. How did they get rich? Did they have import substitution systems and restrictions on trade and state-subsidized industries? Actually, they did, from the 1950s until about the late 1970s. And it failed. It became the poorest of these Anglo-Saxon countries around the world. It was a failure. They abandoned it in the 1980s and they moved towards free markets and free trade. So let's look at how they have become rich. Let's look at their exports. 30.4% of New Zealand exports. Dairy, eggs, and honey. 14.3% meat. 7.6% wood. 5.6% fruit and nuts. 3.7% beverages and spirits and vinegar. 3.6% modified starches. 3.5% cereal and milk preparations, 2.6% fish, and finally, number 9, machinery, including computers, 2.6%. They became rich exporting agricultural goods. There's nothing in economics that says you can only become rich by exporting machines or tractors. Exporting eggs and honey creates wealth just as surely as exporting automobiles and tractors. 100 cedis worth of eggs or honey, or 100 cedis worth of automobiles or tractors, is 100 cedis worth. That's what matters. It's value, not the character of whether it's a machine or honey. So let me introduce you to a quick thought experiment. Imagine a very, very poor country. Indoor plumbing is a luxury of the very rich in this country. More than 1 out of 4 children, 28%, die before the age of 5. 43% of workers 10 years and older work just to grow food in agriculture. And that doesn't count the almost universal use of child labor on farms, which is called chores. Nearly 10% of the working population 10 years or older provide domestic and personal services for the wealthy people in that country. No one has a cell phone or a television or a radio. The average life expectancy is 44 years. That's 16 years fewer than in Democratic Republic of the Congo. What is this poor country? Well, it's the country my grandparents were born in the year 1890. At the time, one of the richest countries in the world, and still a wealthy country. Economic development is the difference between their lives and our lives. Having a cell phone, having indoor plumbing, having drinkable, potable water, and not seeing 1 of 4 of your children die before the age of 5. That's economic development. It's not just building factories or investment parks, although that can bring it. But don't confuse the tool with the final product. So my grandparents were poorer in life expectancy, health care, dental care, and so much more than even some of the poorest people in the world today. And what made the difference? George Ayittey understood very well. It was innovation and freedom to exchange, freedom to innovate, and freedom to engage in exchange. He noted that the informal sector, which is so disrespected in much of Africa, is the source of the economic growth of rich countries. He mentions Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, Henry Ford, who brought the Model T automobile to poor people to be able to afford a car. They were the informal sector. Ford didn't start by setting up a giant company with a board of directors and listed on the New York Stock Exchange. He experimented and tinkered in a stable with internal combustion engines. Or think, more recently, Apple Computer, set up by some nerdy, weird kids in a garage, just a garage. And now Apple Computer is a world leading in computer production. That was the informal sector. One difference was the freedom to move from the informal to the formal. You didn't have to ask for permission. You didn't have to go to the ministry of denying permissions, which is what most people suffer from in Africa. You didn't have to fill out pages and pages and pages and pages of paper that was ignored and not even read by the officials until you could make the official happy with a little bit of a gift. They didn't have to do that. And that is why those countries became wealthier. Now, George's attitude about domestic and foreign was he said, yes, borrow from abroad what works. Humanity's history is a history of borrowing from each other, copying what other people have done. That's fine. Borrow what works, but do not discard what works locally. Do not disrespect your own ancestors' achievements in the institutions they created, traditional institutions that stood the test of time, had limited power, solved local problems, adjudicated local disputes. African chieftains and kings could be removed from power. They could be destooled if they were abusive and acted against the interests of their people. They could be removed. There's long histories of this, of kings who screwed up or were abusive or domineering or stealing from people, and the people removed them from power. How many African presidents, once they get in power, are willing to submit to that? Not so many, because they have an army. He argued that this assault on indigenous institutions was a catastrophe. The post-colonial states inherited a very harmful trait from the colonial powers, and that was not being willing to be accountable. The colonial powers were not accountable to the people here because they were sent from London or from Paris. That's where the boss was. And then the rulers who inherited those power structures felt the same way. Why should I have to answer to these local people? They wanted to be dictators and not leaders. An African intellectual once said something that really was, again, an eye-opening moment for me. On a radio program here in Ghana, Joy FM, there was a discussion of Robert Mugabe's policies. And Mugabe seized power. The difference between Zimbabwe and South Africa is so strong. South Africa had Nelson Mandela. Unfortunately, Zimbabwe got Robert Mugabe, who proceeded to murder huge numbers of Zimbabweans. The massacre in Ndebeleland was horrific. Whole villages of people put to death by Mugabe. And this Nigerian who had spent a lot of time in Zimbabwe, been there 11 times, he said something Africans will understand, but foreigners have difficulty. He said, if Mugabe had wanted to help his country, he could have become a king and not president. To foreigners, that sounds odd. I think Africans understand better. African kings are about creating peace in the community, and they're answerable to the community. But the president often is not. They consider themselves above the community and cannot be removed. And George Ayittey said, it's important to keep those institutions that work, and those institutions of limited power were functional in Africa, and the colonial powers replaced them with something unaccountable and violent. Now, think about democracy. And here's another insight that I think is more African in some ways, but other people understand it too. It's not just about voting and imposing your will on the minority. That is not democracy. Democracy is fundamentally government by discussion. The word parliament means the place where people talk. That's what village councils are about also. That's what councils of elders do. They talk. So before you decide on a position, you first talk about it. That's democracy is about government by discussion. And for that, what do you need? Freedom to discuss. Freedom of speech. Freedom to say that the leader has made a mistake. And when you don't have that freedom, there's no democracy, even if formally you have votes. But no one is free to express an opinion that's different from the rulers. And traditional African governance systems had that element. How much better it might have been if they'd been allowed to evolve, to modernize, to solve problems of the modern world, rather than being suppressed. 5 minutes? Well, that didn't happen. But the past cannot be undone, but there's no reason to perpetuate this mistake. Instead, as George pointed out, listen to traditional practices and modernize those rather than suppressing them or discarding them. There are many examples, and I really recommend this book, Applied Economics for Africa, which explores them in great detail and depth. In conclusion, I hope you'll be inspired, as I was, and as I continue to be, by the work of Professor George B. N. Ayittey, a pioneer, a visionary, a scholar, and also a personal friend. I miss him very much, and I wish that he were here with us now. He left us on January 22nd of last year, but his works do remain, and his thoughts are still active every time a student opens one of his books and is moved by them. And I encourage you to visit AfricanLiberty.org or the African Center for Enterprise and Youth Empowerment and download this book. You can be inspired by George's work, as I was, and he would hope that you would go beyond him, that you would do better, that you would add to this knowledge, generate new understandings, and blaze a way to a free and flourishing Africa, proud of its achievements, hopeful for the future. And you would make George proud of all of you. So I'd like to thank George Ayittey for what he's done for me. I want to thank you for attending this talk. The future of Africa is in your hands.